Welcome to the Law and Society Trust's Roundtable. On this edition, we will be discussing Budget 2024. And we are very pleased to be joined once again by Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, Senior Lecturer in the University of Jaffna, also Vice President of the Federation of University Teachers Association. Ahilan, let's begin with how a budget is perhaps often perceived. From a from most people's standpoint, it's about what's in it for us. What's there that's going to be of some benefit to us. But for others, of course, a budget is also about getting a sense of a government's economic direction, its understanding of where a country is at, or where a country's economy is at, but also, I suppose, a sort of a vision, isn't it, of where they would like the country to go to. And that's not just an economic vision. I mean, that's also a vision of a particular kind of society and so on. So let's just start at the top. 10 days ago, 13th of November, we had the president in his capacity as Minister of Finance, deliver the budget speech in Parliament. So in the run-up to that, lots of people were wondering, okay, is this going to be an election budget? Because next year, 2024, we anticipate parliamentary and presidential elections. But of course, others were saying, no, hang on, we are in year one of an IMF agreement. The situation is still quite rocky, and the government will do its best not to displease the IMF, so that it will be an IMF budget. What's your take on this? I mean, what do you make of this budget? How will you characterize it? What is it for? What is this budget, and who is it for?
Thank you, Kumar, for having me on the program again. I think this budget is all the more important because we are in a very deep economic crisis, unprecedented in our history. The worst economic crisis probably since the 1930s. And so in addition to, even though people might just look at, well, what is in it for us? Is the price of Paripu going to come down? Is there going to be some investment in a particular sector? And also beyond, what direction is the government is going? How is our government going to dig ourselves out of this deep crisis? I mean, the devastation is, I think, clear to all of us. Our economy contracted by 7.8% of GDP, right? A country like ours, we should be aiming to grow at least 5%, preferably 8 to 10%, but we are in the opposite direction. We are contracting. Over the last few years, probably our economy has contracted by 20% with the COVID crisis. So what kind of relief are people going to get? Is our economy going to get back on track? Is the big question. But the government seems to be really focused, one, on the IMF agreement, right? I would say over the last 7-8 months, our economic policy making is almost on autopilot. We are just following the IMF benchmarks and what is there in the World Bank country partnership framework. These are 4-year term agreements, programs. And the government really doesn't seem to be thinking about how to get either the people or the economy out of this crisis. So on this IMF path, and austerity is very much a part of it, and by austerity I mean that very little government expenditure for people and programs and even investment for that matter. Along with that, their vision is one of serving commercial interests. What do I mean by commercial interests, right? It's about what is best for business, what is best for the private sector, and more importantly, over the last 4.5 decades, not just in Sri Lanka, all over the world, finance capital has been dominant. Big financiers, the banking sector. And as we all know, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt last year, and much of that debt is owed to powerful bondholders, hedge funds, Western pension funds, insurance companies who buy Sri Lanka's debt. And this budget, when I say it's in the interests of commercial actors, it's focused on repaying them their debt and then creating a climate in Sri Lanka where those who might be interested in taking forward commercial interests are given all sorts of goodies, if you may, right? And the government is cash strapped. I think we acknowledge that. But what was surprising to me was that the president coming out and openly saying that he's going to push through 60 new laws and amendments. Imagine 60 new laws and amendments. That's almost a new law or an amendment every week over the next year. Why are they in such a hurry? What are in those laws and amendments? And we already have heard about a new, everything from a new Fisheries Act, a new Higher Education Act, a new banking law, new land laws, a new public finance management laws. So all of this, for whom? It is to serve these very powerful private commercial interests. So in that sense, I see this budget, of course it is trying to meet the IMF conditions without questioning them. It is really neglectful of the people in this country, because there's no relief in it for them. And most of all, it is only concerned about the private actors, the multinationals, and they may not even come, but they are bending over backwards to invite them with all these legal changes.
Right. So you're saying that this is an IMF budget, and the goodies in the budget are for the private sector, and particularly for foreign private capital. Okay, let's come back to some of this as we go along. Let's just look at the budget, in the terms in which it's being presented, right, by those who advocate for it, who support it. Cabinet spokesperson Bandula Gurwardena recently commented on the budget that it has 4 features, 4 aspects to it. First, it's a budget which is to increase government revenue, increase the government's income. Secondly, it's a budget which is to rationalize government expenditure, its spending, as much as possible to control it. Thirdly, he argues that it's a budget which is foreign investor friendly. It's about making Sri Lanka a desirable place for foreign capital to come, to invest, and so on. And finally, he said it's a budget which keeps Sri Lanka on track to meet that very central obligation in the IMF agreement, which is that we should have a balance of payments surplus, a surplus in our primary account. In other words, Sri Lanka should be in a situation where its income has been greater than its expenditure. It's not a deficit economy or budget, but a surplus one. So, okay, so these are the 4 features or aspects broadly, but I mean, please feel free to say something about each of them. But I'd also like you to maybe help us, take a step back also, because a budget and the proposals in the budget are about an intervention in a in an existing state of affairs. And what's that state of affairs for us here in Sri Lanka? We are in an economic crisis. We are in a situation where in 2023 and in the first half of 2023, our economy has contracted even further, according to the World Bank, by something like 7.5%, right? So I think it's only been once or twice our economy has even grown at that rate of 7.5%, but here we have a contraction. Secondly, we have this situation, we are an economy within a global economy. And that global economy and global geopolitics is in a very, very fragile state. It's in a state of enormous upheaval. There don't seem to be any good signs coming in terms of global economic trends. And certainly Russia's continuing war in Ukraine, Israel's war in Gaza, all have ramifications for where Sri Lanka is in terms of its place in that economy. And as much as there's that constant, rhetoric about how we need to make ourselves foreign investor friendly, well, they just ain't coming. And we are not seeing. Each year, the Board of Investment has these what seem to be very ambitious targets for FDI flows, foreign direct investment flows, and we never seem to, meet those targets. And that's true again for 2023, where I think we're now looking at something like maybe 1.3 billion. And even that, that's my understanding is that's 1.3 billion is agreements inked. It's not the same as saying that $1.3 billion is somehow floating around in our treasury or in our economy and so on. So, and of course, finally, the dire socioeconomic situation of the majority of our people, grappling with cost of living, grappling with wages that have not gone up to match that cost of living, grappling with inflation despite the engineering of the consumer price index to make it seem as if the rate of increase is now suddenly down to single digits compared to the double digits of last year and year before. So in your view, do you see this budget being a budget which responds to this context that I have presented?
Yeah, Kumar, not at all. And let's look at it, let's break it down and then come to the macro picture. Let's take revenues, for example. Of course, we need to increase our revenues. Sri Lanka's revenues globally, as a percentage of GDP, are abysmally low. We have to increase revenues, but the economy is also about its times and its place in history. In the middle of an economic crisis, as you mentioned, when the economy continues to collapse, when incomes are collapsing, can you really raise revenue in that way? Because everybody's incomes are low. What we should be doing is not going after this flow of incomes, but the stock of wealth in this country. That the wealthy in this country have accumulated over the last few decades. But that's been put aside. They said maybe in 2025, everything else is a rush, maybe in 2025 there will be a wealth tax. What are they doing next year? They are increasing the VAT by 3% more to 18%. What is its impact going to be? You're increasing the burden on people. But even if you think of it in economic terms, that will probably further reduce consumption. Ranil Wickremesinghe has claimed to have solved the fuel queues and so on. What happened last year? They tripled the price of petrol and diesel, and the consumption of petrol and diesel came down by 50% by the end of the year, right? That is not solving the fuel crisis. That is dampening demand, and that's why we went into a contraction. So is that what's going to happen with revenues as well? And when it comes to expenditure, if the state doesn't invest, and certainly during a crisis like this, the private sector is not going to invest. Their market is now, as I mentioned, 20% smaller. So why would you invest? You would try to just generate whatever profits that you can with whatever sunk capital that you have, whatever investments that you already have. You're not going to invest. So then that's not going to stimulate the economy, but these austerity measures are going to further reduce state expenditure. So there'll be less circulation of money as salaries, incomes, because this is the great lesson from the depression of the 1930s that Keynes said, even if it means you just dig holes and bury money, that would at least get some people some jobs.
Sort of a stimulus.
A stimulus, yeah. But no sign of that. And then what Bandula Gunawardena is talking about, that suddenly somehow these inflows of whether foreign direct investment or portfolio flows, foreign capital coming in. If you look at FDI over the last decade and a half, even what they call FDI never really was, foreign direct investment to take forward production. That is what our vision of FDI is, that new factories will come, it'll create jobs, we increase production. Much of a majority of what we call FDI was actually speculative investment in real estate, right? Condominiums, hotels. Now, are we going to get enough returns on that? Is it sustainable? That's part of the reason why we went into the crisis. And now with the crisis, who is going to, is Sri Lanka the great place to come and speculate and invest? So are those flows going to come in? Or if you look at, as you mentioned, the global situation, the Federal Reserve continues to increase its interest rates. In 2010 to 2013, when we had a lot more capital flowing in, interest rates in the Western world was close to zero.
Indeed.
Now it's up to 5%. Right? So any Western capitalist can just put it in a treasury bond and earn that much. So if they are to come to a third world country, and that to a country that has defaulted, even other countries, they're asking for a 10% premium.
Oh.
Right? So it's, in other words, only if you offer 15%.
Right.
Right? Will they, they don't want to take the risk. For a country like Sri Lanka, they would even want more because we have just, for the first time in our history, defaulted. So with all of this, are we going to be able to, what we call the twin deficits, right? The budget deficit, or particularly a primary budget surplus, which is the condition for next year in the IMF agreement, that we should have about 0.7% of GDP excess in revenue over expenditure.
Right.
It just seems unrealistic. Right? Even if they put the burden on the working people, the one plan that the government might have is to sell the family silver. Right? Privatize the Ceylon Electricity Board, privatize the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. In the budget, the president has come out very clearly and said that they're going to capitalize the banks, they're going to borrow, print money, capitalize the banks, but they're also going to divest 20% of the shares of the Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank.
Right.
That's not a creative solution, because that is basically selling our future, right?
Okay, can I just press you a little on that? You were saying selling the family silver, referring to these public utilities. But the narrative, Ahilan, is that, hang on, these are enormous loss-making corporations. They're a drain on the public exchequer. And the reason the balance sheet of our state banks is so poor is because they've been advancing loans to state-owned enterprises like Sri Lankan Airlines or the Petroleum Corporation, perhaps the Electricity Board, so that what we see here is a sort of a vicious cycle, and that it needs to somehow, we need to get out of it. So could you explain why then? I mean, so firstly, if these public utilities are such inefficient things, why should private investors wish to then, get their hands on these? I mean, what's in it for capital? Because you're an investor, you're a business person. It's not about, I want to provide electricity to every household in this country. It's about, I want to make sure that my profits, my income keeps rising. That's what my business is. So why there? And then secondly, yes, when it comes again to the state banks, that's, you mentioned, so 20%. Of course, the rhetoric is to make it available to the public, making it seem as if every citizen can now buy some shares and feel somehow she or he is the owner of I don't know, a part of the Bank of Ceylon, 0.001% of the Bank of Ceylon or something. But realistically, it'll be institutional investors, won't it, who would want to sort of come in and so on. And again, what do you think might be in their interests? Something interesting has happened, isn't it, with this Union Bank recently? A Nepali billionaire has basically acquired Union Bank here. So, could you give us a sense maybe of what's behind some of this and what some of the agendas? You were also saying this is a commercial budget, right? So this is a budget about very much pleasing, placating those interests. So yeah, just a little bit, please, on the CB and then perhaps also on the state banks.
Yeah. So it's during a crisis, a government is desperate, as all of us. And in a way, this is the worst time to also privatize or to sell our assets, because we have no bargaining power. So there is likely to be what we call a fire sale of assets at much lower prices than their actual value. And as you mentioned, investors are not going to come in unless they can make a profit, and that to a big profit. And that is what they have their eyes on, right? So now, even, I don't really care that much about Sri Lankan Airlines, because not ordinary people are not dependent on it. But even Sri Lankan Airlines, there was an announcement, and there was a Reuters article which said, now with the support of the World Bank's IFC, they are going to privatize, they're going to sell Sri Lankan Airlines, right? But Sri Lankan Airlines over the last year has made an operating profit of $91 million US. So you have to first get it to a profit-making point. That is when investors are going to come in. Now let's take the other sectors, which are much more important for people. What have they done to electricity? Why were they such loss-making entities? Of course, they can be made more efficient. We have to constantly be vigilant about that, bring much better management practices. We need to make all those improvements. But the bulk of what they're calling losses were really subsidies to the people. In Sri Lanka is a miracle in a sense that almost 99% of our people were connected to the electricity grid.
Indeed.
But over the last year, 500,000 people, 500,000 people have been disconnected from the electricity grid. What happened? Well, they increased the prices. If you don't care about the people, you can always make it an even more profit-making entity, but then people won't be able to afford electricity. So that is what's in the cards. And once you privatize it, then the profit motive sets in. It's no longer a public service. And the same with banks. Even the World Bank during the COVID crisis came out and said that the importance of state banks in South Asia. Because during a crisis, what would private banks do? They would only think about their balance sheet, profit and loss, and they won't try to help us get out of the crisis. For them, profit is the bottom line. But what happened last year? The central bank increased the interest rates. Bank lending rates went up to 29%.
Make it more expensive for people.
For even businesses, small businesses
to operate. Because,
So once that sets in, it's 20%, 40%, 60%, and then you lose control of the banking sector. It can have other shocks on the economy as well, right? So I think this is a very dangerous trend. The country, can possibly lose a lot because we are privatizing at the worst time possible when we have no bargaining power. And two, what this might do in terms of our future is also a big question in terms of the price of services to our people, right? So that's on the fiscal side. Are they trying to privatize and bring money in? On the balance of payment side, are these flows going to come in? Really, we are sustaining our economy not on the IMF funds. The IMF funds are peanuts, let's be honest. It's $3 billion over 4 years. It's about 60 million US dollars per month. Whereas foreign earnings, the hard-earned wealth of our tea pluckers, our garment sector workers, our migrant workers, comes to about 1.8 billion, 1,800 million, right? 30 times what the IMF is providing us. And that is how we've sustained our economy through this crisis. But we also took certain steps, maybe too late, is that we restricted our imports. Because balance of payments is about our foreign earnings versus our import bill. Now there's a lot of pressure both from the IMF, the European Union, because they are committed to this free market regime to get rid of those import restrictions. And the government is step by step doing that. So would we go into another balance of payment crisis again? Would we be able to repay our debt? We are supposed to get a much bigger haircut, right? A reduction in the debt stock so we can pay much less in debt servicing. That's not happening. The government is not negotiating. They're just in a rush. So what would be the implication if you have to pay all that debt back? We allow imports to just flow in. And we may not even be able to manage with all these hard-earned foreign earnings of our people.
That's what it appears, counterintuitive. We were told that the problem is this deficit, this shortfall between our income, our revenue, and our expenditure. But as you said, the thrust of this budget is to encourage liberalization when it comes to the import sector. So if that happens, and as you mentioned, the reason why those players are very interested in that is because that's kind of what they export to Sri Lanka. It's the luxury vehicles, right? It's the high-end cars and so on.
Keep in mind that in this budget, they're pushing through 4 or 5 free trade agreements they've mentioned, right? With Thailand, with Indonesia, with China, a revamped free trade agreement with India. We already have one on investment and services. So what you mentioned as import liberalization is now public.
Right. So in other words, a year from now, we'll be looking at a situation in which, if all goes according to the government's plan, the deficit, the gap between imports and exports is actually going to be wider than it has been this year and certainly last year. So in other words, we're not digging ourselves out of a hole, we appear to be digging ourselves even deeper. Deeper into it.
Because the government keeps saying, well, our economic model is a export-led growth model. But that is where what you mentioned, the war in Ukraine is continuing, Middle East is flared up into this huge crisis, the global markets are volatile. Who are we going to export to when there's so much competition? So that option is also very limited. So I almost feel like this government and the budget is on an ideological terrain of believing somehow that if you open up the market will somehow again solve all our problems without looking at the realities of how both the global economy and our economy is going to work. And with all of this, what happens with free trade is that the bargaining power of the workers further reduce. Already, the real incomes of workers have come down by 50%. Compared to 2 years ago, the consumer price index, if it was at 100 2 years ago, now it is at 202. So over 100%, or in other words, the actual purchasing power has come down by 50%. Then you bring about these free trade agreements, imports come in, even in terms of what we produce. Then our own businesses would have to further repress wages to be able to compete with it. So the bargaining power of workers will further reduce, their incomes will further reduce. So these are also not just about the global market, but have very serious implications for our workers and their future.
And let's unpick the budget a little bit now. Let's turn to some specifics in the budget speech, beginning with the expenditure side. The president, in his budget speech, said that government revenue in 2024 will mostly go into three areas. First, the public sector payroll and pensions. So public sector workers as well as former retired workers. Secondly, into social assistance. And finally, and of these three, it's debt servicing that will command the lion's share of government revenue. There's an estimate of around 65% of all government revenue in 2024 going into debt servicing. This is in a situation in which we are in default. And firstly, could you kind of just explain this? Is this assuming that, well, I mean, under the IMF agreement, there was to be a sort of a moratorium on external debt repayments, excluding multilateral loans till 2027, right? Till the agreement ends. So what's happening here? I mean, what does the government mean when it talks about debt servicing here? And then if we look at the social assistance, well, the government's flagship Aswesuma program, it's now been allocated 183 billion. Sounds like a lot of money. Perhaps you could just sort of help us understand that a little bit. But meanwhile, the allocation for defense and public security combined continues to rise, as it has consistently since the end of the war in 2009. So we have an allocation of 564.44 billion, whereas the allocation for education being school education, vocational, technical and higher, altogether stagnates at around 237 billion. So sort of under half of what's allocated for defense and public security. So can you just sort of unpack some of this and sort of contextualize what's going on here? Because otherwise these figures, sometimes some figures sound very good.
Yeah.
They sound very large, very big, lots and lots of money. So this has to be a good thing.
Yes, Kumar, these are all very important questions as we analyze the budget. And as you mentioned, there is a huge amount of allocations for debt servicing. And to be able to do that, the president has come out and said that he wants an agreement to increase the debt ceiling, right? So that the government is going to borrow more, something on the order of 3.4 trillion rupees, almost over and above what our revenues were this year, to be able to mainly repay debt. So what is increasing the debt ceiling? It's deficit spending, you can say, or it's the government going out and getting debt, or this is what they've been attacking all along as money printing, right? Money printing was never about there's a printing machine, printing money, right? It's about the government floating more debt. And now they have given the authority to actually go out and borrow more, that much more, to be able to repay the creditors. In other words, they are not negotiating adequately with the creditors. As I mentioned, there's going to be a very low haircut. And they are trying to give the creditors the confidence, look, we are borrowing all this money to be able to repay. Right?
New loans for old loans.
No loans. So that is one part of this. If you look at expenditure for social services, for social welfare, there has been a steady decline. It's a little hard, for example, to calculate the exact amount, for example, for education and some of these services. So we might have to wait a little bit because it is split into now our education budget. There's the education ministry. Then a lot of it also goes to the provincial councils. right? So each provincial council then has a education
Right.
budget. So it'll be, I think, a little higher. But even with that, Sri Lanka last year, and I'm sure next year, is one of the lowest spenders in terms of education in South Asia, well below 1.5% of GDP. You know, FUTA, we had a campaign 10 years ago calling for 6% of GDP for education, both general education and higher education together.
Right.
But now we are probably getting close to that 1% mark. If you look at expenditure for the universities, which we know because the UGC has a separate line item in the appropriations bill and so on, it's an abysmal 0.25% of GDP, right? What was it 4 years ago? It was 0.6%, so less than halved for the universities. And this is something close to my heart because now we are actually wondering, where are the classrooms? I mean, in some universities, the reality is we can only teach 1 or 2 lectures face-to-face and we have to teach the other online because there are no classroom space. Because capital expenditure for universities next year is going to be 0.02% of GDP, coming down from 0.016, an eighth. There's no investment. So this is our legacy, of having had very high human development indicators. All that is coming under threat.
So you have an existing infrastructure which is not going to be improved, enhanced, but more and more students coming in, and then the narrative will be, the public universities are failing these students in a situation in which you, as you said, you simply don't have the space for them to physically be there. There'll be issues, I'm sure, around hostel space and accommodation for them. And we have a large number of vacancies at all levels, particularly including, academic staff, many of whom at any point in time may be on study leave, but also now increasingly large numbers seeking to leave the country. So this is
the reality,
yeah.
And this is the reality of higher education. And as you mentioned, over the last number of years, the student intake has increased by 50%.
Wow.
Right? But the education budget is almost, for the universities, almost a third. Right? So you can imagine, so it's almost as if they are committed to making the universities fail.
Right.
But this is also happening to the health sector, to the education sector. And so this is something that the people in this country have to take very seriously. Which direction is our government going in terms of social spending?
So, as you use the term, this is a sort of an ideological budget, an ideological approach, because empirically, it seems to make very little sense in terms of its own rationality of how an economy functions in capitalism. But from what you're saying, the trend is to ideologically to sort of delegitimize the public sphere and public provision of these services, which is something that the public, the citizens, have come to expect as their right, as an obligation of the state that they live in towards them, and of course then to make them more sympathetic or receptive to private provisioning of what are public goods. What ought to be an entitlement of every person in this country, regardless of where he or she lives, or her socioeconomic status, or her identity, or his identity. So this certainly worrying scenario. Let's now look at the revenue side of things, right? Because for the government to spend on the things that we want it to spend on too, it needs to boost its income. That's something you said right at the top too, that it's a matter that lots of us take seriously, critics of the government included. So the government seems to have ambitious plans to increase government revenue to around 4,127 billion. That's 4.1 trillion. I mean, from a baseline in 2023, where its revenue collection is expected to be around 2.4 trillion, 2,410 billion rupees. So it's a massive leap in almost a doubling of the government's income from this year. And the revenue proposals appear to sort of, sit on three legs. First, to increase VAT from 15% currently to 18% as of January. So in other words, to increase indirect taxation. Secondly, to widen the personal income tax net through opening more tax files, so have more people potentially as taxpayers. And thirdly, to improve the collection of taxes, which is something that has customarily been done by the Customs Department in terms of at point of entry into Sri Lanka, and the Inland Revenue Department when it comes to our national or domestic economy, by creating a revenue authority, so something new, a new body or new institution. So these are the sort of three prongs of the government's approach. And as you mentioned earlier, there's still no talk about taxes on the super rich, the wealth tax, which does make an appearance in the IMF agreement, but which appears to be postponed indefinitely. And we've seen banks and financial services making super profits in Sri Lanka from the COVID period onwards, in excess of quarterly profits in excess of 1 billion rupees. And we have this situation where constantly the government is also saying that, look, we, as a foreign investor-friendly destination, we're going to offer you more and more tax breaks, tax holidays. We see it already in the Port City development. And in fact, this has been contested by one of the government's own advisors, a former IMF official to boot. So what do you make of the government's revenue proposals? I mean, what do you make of it? Are you convinced in terms of the targets? Are you convinced in terms of the logic? What's going on?
Yeah. No, I think the likely scenario is that, again, we won't be able to meet these targets. And when they can't meet these revenue targets, what would most likely happen? Now, if you look at the other side of it, the expenditure side, there is about 1,260 billion rupees for capital expenditure. Now, the salaries, the recurrent expenditure, it's very hard for them to cut. But what happens is there's all these wonderful proposals that the president read out during the budget. Most likely, most of them won't be implemented, right? In other words, if the revenue targets fall by 500 billion or 1 trillion rupees, then what they'll do is they would cut these expenditure budgets, right? So, which means that 0.02% for the universities might go down to 0%, right? And the same for all the other ministries, because it's just almost close to impossible to extract just on the flow of incomes this level, because people's consumption, so even the VAT, the people's consumption is likely to fall. I mean, we knew this was going to happen. During the last IMF staff review, they themselves later come and say, oh, you know, both the revenue targets and the growth targets are seeing a downside. No surprise to us, that's what we said, if you go in this direction, and we're going to see more of that next year, right? So in terms of the logic also, without going after that stock of wealth, it doesn't make sense. But I think the alternative there would be not to go after the wealthy, but to go after the wealth of the public, the CEBs, the banks, right? Which has been accumulated over the decades by the people. I mean, we saw an example of this, and we talked about this last time. What happened with domestic debt restructuring, right? It is the working people's retirement funds that came under attack. So they might again do this as the solution for the revenue shortfall.
Finally, Ahilan, it's certain that the 2024 budget will receive parliamentary approval on third reading on the 13th of December. And that's certain because we have in Parliament a rotten majority that's inherited from the 2019 election. But that's, of course, a Parliament which lacks public legitimacy now. But regardless, this majority will ensure that the President's budget proposals go through. Now, we've also spoken about how in this budget speech, all of the social sectors, from public and private sector workers, farmers, fishers, plantation workers, the urban poor, the new poor among the lower middle class, will all be affected, will have their living standards assaulted even further in a more aggressive way in this budget. But up to now, of course, it's just been a couple of weeks since we've learnt of these proposals. We haven't really seen any manifestation of unhappiness, of anger, of outrage. It's a fairly sort of quiet situation on our streets. So, I mean, how do we account for this? I mean, what do you think is going on? Is it that we have yet to perhaps feel this in our pockets? I mean, it'll be really from January that we'll see with the VAT increase how almost everything we buy is now more expensive, even though the money in our pocket hasn't increased. And once, of course, all those increases then affect the rest of the economy, from the cost of a lunch packet to a hospital consultation to the tuition masters' fees for our kids. I mean, perhaps it'll be at that point that it'll really hit home what's happening here. But or do you think, I mean, there's simply sort of resignation among people that, yes, we don't like the situation, but we really can't see a way out, which means basically a failure of the opposition. The failure of the opposition, both in Parliament and outside of Parliament, to say to people, well, there's always an alternative. I mean, there's always other ways in which a problem can be addressed in ways that are less harmful, or hopefully not even harmful, and perhaps even better for you, so that you're in a... So, I mean, are we stuck, in an austerity trap? I mean, that's where we are now. Are we stuck in this trap? Is there any way out? I mean, what can we do? What should we be doing as concerned citizens, as critical-minded people?
Yes, Kumar, I think you put it rightly. This a rotten majority in Parliament is going to pass a rotten budget. I think that's how we can look at it. And unfortunately, the political opposition, both within Parliament and outside Parliament, are not giving a vision. They're visionless to be able to deal with this crisis. And, last year, the hundreds of thousands of millions of people who came out on the street looking for a different world, a different country, they've been greatly disappointed that all their valiant efforts have not translated into social, economic, and political gain. So I think in a sense there is a bit of resignation. People are trying to think about how to put food on the table the next day, these very day-to-day concerns. So that is going along, and it takes some time for people to understand, because they're also very much confused by all these pronouncements. The IMF agreement, billions, trillions of rupees, it's all of this is very hard for people to understand. But I think there's something in this budget that is likely to stir people. In particular, look at what they're going to do with land and agriculture. 300,000 acres of land are going to be given to agribusinesses. Now, I work with the cooperatives, agriculture cooperatives, fisheries cooperatives. Now, we know that if a family has 2 acres of land, at least they won't starve, because they will be able to at least produce rice and vegetables for subsistence. What are they doing with fisheries? They're going to give licenses for big multinational corporations to come in, fish in their waters and undermine. We are an island nation. That's one of our biggest resources. So when you start to touch land and water and the seas, that is much more tangible than interest rates and, right? And I think we're starting to see some rumblings about that. But nevertheless, it's really important for there to be a political vision, because ultimately this is a political question about the future of our country and how that will coalesce together. If you look at the history of our country, it's when working people, workers in the factories, farmers, fisherfolk, when they come together, that changes happen. And time and again, we've thrown out these regimes. And next year also happens to be an election year. If they hold elections, we expect many changes. If they don't hold elections also, we can expect a big reaction from the people, because that is something that all our people, you've looked at every election, it becomes a carnival type of situation where people start talking, debating, discussing. For now, I think the great mass of people are worried about their day-to-day concerns, but it's also becoming clear they've given a certain lease of time for this government, and I think it's becoming very clear to them whose interest this government is serving. It's serving the interests of a small elite in Sri Lanka, and as I mentioned, the commercial interests globally. And whether, what would be the feather that finally breaks the back of the camel in terms of then people again taking charge. And I think this budget has made their plans very public. So it's now really important for social movements, trade unions, even if we don't have that political leadership, for them to start to work with people to at least ideologically dig ourselves out of this austerity trap, if you may, or I have sometimes called it an IMF trap, where we are beholden to the IMF because we have defaulted on our debt and we have to somehow resolve that situation. So, but to place it squarely in terms of the concerns of the people, and then to be able to demand both political and economic challenges. So I think, the trade unions, the people's movements, opinion makers, intellectuals have a really important duty, if I may, to work with the people as we go through one of the worst economic crises. But we've been there before. I always think about this crisis. I began by saying this is the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. How did we come out of that crisis in the 1930s? That is what pushed us, the malaria crisis and the Great Depression. That is what pushed us to then address our health system.
Right.
Free healthcare.
Right.
Children couldn't go to school. We brought about a free education system in the 1940s. People could not eat. We brought about a food subsidy. These are times to rethink the entire trajectory and the vision for our future. The government has abysmally failed, and are we ready to take up that challenge?
Thank you very much, Ahilan, for joining this LST Roundtable and talking to us about your thoughts on Budget 2024. I hope that the conversation will carry on in people's homes, workplaces, in their community spaces and so on, and that we will see citizens asking more and more difficult questions of their public representatives, particularly, as you said, in the run-up to what we think will be election year 2024. Thank you, Ahilan.
Thank you, Kumar.